These are Drew Hill's predictions for the college football season in 2024. This year's going to be interesting because the expanded playoff means more teams have an opportunity. And some people have said that they don't like the idea of the expanded playoff because it makes the games less important because now, you can pick up a loss here, you can pick up a loss there that you couldn't before. Games don't matter as much because more teams can get in. But I actually think the opposite can be true because now more games are more important for more teams. Like in years past, I mean, yeah, the game is more important, but it's really only important if you're one of the six teams who have a chance to make it in November. Because by November, most teams are eliminated. So if you're Alabama, yeah, the games matter more. But if you're Georgia Tech or if you're Iowa or if you're some other team, the games don't really matter in November, except for getting a bowl game. I mean, they still matter to that team, but in terms of playoff potential, now, it's not just for Alabama and Georgia and Ohio State, but now those games in November matter for a lot more teams because now there's 5 auto bids. So 5 conferences will get to send at least one team. You also have 7 at-large spots, so more teams will get in. And so yes, more teams can lose more, and so that does potentially hurt the quality, but it also helps make some of the games more exciting, more interesting for other teams and other fans late into the year. Another thing I do like about the playoff is yes, there's going to be arguments over who should get the last spot. There's going to be snubs. That happens even, in the NCAA tournament for basketball, which has 68 teams. But I think the stakes for getting a pick wrong are lower. So, for example, instead of picking between an SEC champion with one loss and an undefeated team that lost their quarterback, like last year between Alabama and Florida State, now the argument's going to be, do we put in the 9-3 SEC team or the 10-2 Big 12 team? So I think the stakes are lower too. Yeah, there's going to be snubs, but there's something you could have done about it. There's not really anything Florida State could have done better last year to make themselves get into the playoff. They won all their games other than not letting their quarterback get hurt, which was out of their control. So now it's like, okay, you missed the playoff. Yeah, maybe you're mad. Maybe you felt like you deserved it because you went 9-3 in a tougher conference, or you went 10-2, won more games than another team, but you still lost those 2 or 3 games that you could have won. I do think that's another benefit of the expanded playoff. And since this is the first year of it, it's going to be really interesting and I think really exciting to see how it all turns out. People are expecting this to just be dominated by the SEC and the Big Ten, but anything can happen. To be honest, this year looking at the Big 12, I don't know if I'd call it the deepest conference because they don't have the top level talents like the SEC and the Big Ten have in terms of like true title contenders. But I would say that it's definitely going to be interesting to see who comes out of the Big 12 and gets that auto bid. There's, 6, 7, 8 teams who could all really have a chance to win. That'll be an exciting thing to watch. Personally, I don't see any Big 12 teams finishing with less than 2 losses, but we had back-to-back years where a Big 12 team ended with 1 loss, made the college football playoff with TCU and then Texas last year. The 2 most common teams I've seen listed as favorites to win the auto bid out of the Big 12, Utah, formerly of the Pac-12, and Kansas State, who has been steadily rising, very consistent Big 12 program over the last few years. And I don't really have any problems with that. I think overall, I would say Utah is probably the best Big 12 team this year. But as you can see from the standings, I have a 3-way tie at the top in conference standings between Kansas State, Utah, and Oklahoma State. It seems we've already forgotten that Oklahoma State did just make the Big 12 championship last year over Oklahoma. Yes, they lost to Texas, but Texas is gone. And so I think Oklahoma State has a good chance to win again this year. Mike Gundy, really consistent coach, is back. Ollie Gordon is back, and he's actually my preseason Big 12 Player of the Year. I do think Kansas State will be good, but I have them getting an upset loss to Arizona in non-conference. Even though it's technically a conference game, it's non-conference this year as well, so they actually play 10 games against Big 12 teams. Worse overall record, but still the same conference record. And then Utah, I have losing to Oklahoma State. Since I have a 3-way tie, it comes down to tiebreakers for who gets to go to the conference championship game. So I did say that I think Utah is the best team in the Big 12 this year. However, they don't play Kansas State. Oklahoma State plays both. So I have Kansas State beating Oklahoma State for one of the losses for Oklahoma State. That gives Kansas State a head-to-head over Oklahoma State, and the second tiebreaker is head-to-head. So since Kansas State did not play Utah and has a head-to-head over Oklahoma State, they would get the 1 seed despite having the worst overall record of the 3. As I said, I had Oklahoma State beating Utah. That would give Oklahoma State the second spot, so Utah being left out of the conference championship game, which comes down between Oklahoma State and Kansas State. Those are the 3 teams I see most likely to win, and I have them tied in the standings, but there are a lot of dark horses in the Big 12 as well. Arizona losing their coach and quite a few of their players, but bringing back their quarterback and star receiver, Tatoria McMillan as the receiver and Kyle Fafita the quarterback. They could be a threat this year, and I'm pretty high on Arizona, not quite as high as the big three, though. I also see Iowa State. After last year starting out 1-2 with losses to Iowa and Ohio, Iowa State did finish the year strong in Big 12 play, going 6-3 with Texas and Oklahoma gone, new teams in. They were a young team last year; they could build on that success. So Iowa State, I would say, is a threat to potentially move on, but I'd put them as a dark horse. Another dark horse contender in the Big 12 is Kansas. With a healthy Jalen Daniels, they have a legit dark horse Heisman threat and have been really good under Lance Leipold the last couple of years. He's come back after significant coaching interest at other schools. So we'll see if Kansas can build on that this year with the departure of Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC. West Virginia had a good year last year. I see them taking a slight step back this year and finishing only 7-5 after winning 9 games last season. Texas Tech would be kind of in that category as well, and potentially UCF. So those are often mentioned teams for dark horses behind the big three favorites. I'm not anticipating big things for some of these other teams. The most interesting is Colorado. After last year's 3-0 start, they proceeded to lose 8 of their last 9 games in Pac-12 play. But Pac-12 was actually really good last year, so I think Colorado could improve this year as they upgrade the talent base. And a lot of people are really low on Colorado right now. There's been a lot of rumors about their coaching and everything else that's come out, and so I think that's part of the contribution to that. However, I still think Colorado does have the talent. Shadir Sanders, if he's on a better team, could be a Heisman contender. Same with Travis Hunter. So they definitely have some talent. They've upgraded a lot of their other talent. They're not going to be playing in the Pac-12 of last year this year. Big 12 is going to be deep with a lot of interesting teams, but I don't think any have the ceiling of teams like Oregon or Washington did last year. So I think Colorado could improve, and so I do have them improving, making a bowl game. I also have them beating Nebraska for the second straight year, after Nebraska will likely be favored over them for the second straight year, and I don't understand why, but the Nebraska bias is very strong every year, so we'll get to them in the Big Ten. So I have several teams making a bowl game, TCU bouncing back, making a bowl, and then at the bottom we have teams like Arizona State and BYU and Houston. Moving on to the ACC. So this year, there's kind of 3 distinctive tiers for hierarchy for college football. You have the SEC and Big Ten, and depending on which one you're a fan of, you can argue for why your conference is the best and will make the biggest impact on the national stage. And then there's the ACC and Big 12, who will likely see their conference champions get the 3 and 4 seed. That is one interesting wrinkle of the playoff is 12 teams, so 4 teams get a bye, but the 4 teams that get a bye have to be conference champions. So even if you have 2 undefeated teams in the SEC or the Big 10, one wins, one loses the conference championship game. The team that lost, the highest seed they can get is the 5 seed, which some people argue could be one of the better spots to be in if you're not going to get like a 1 seed and a bye, because as the 5, you get the worst of the Power 5 conference champions, or at least the 4 seed. So the 4th out of the 5th conference champions. Plus, in the first round, you're likely getting a group of 5 team, unless it's like a really good group of 5 team like Cincinnati or UCF from years past. But this year, probably getting a group of 5 team. So there is some distinctive advantage to potentially finishing in that 5th spot, but you don't get the bye. We're turning to the ACC next. You could argue which one you think is better between ACC and the Big 12. This year, I would say maybe the ACC ceiling is higher, but their depth is not quite as much. There aren't as many contenders in this conference that I see. But there are some teams I'm really interested to see. So looking at the ACC, the big favorites are Florida State, coming off last year's undefeated season and getting snubbed from the playoff. And yes, I do think they should have made the playoff over Alabama, or maybe Texas. I don't know. Texas did beat Alabama, but I think Florida State should have gotten in. But they have their chance this year if they can win the ACC or potentially get in at large. The other favorites, Clemson and Miami. Another dark horse favorite after a surprisingly strong season last year with a lot of turnover was NC State. They added Grayson McCall, the former Coastal Carolina great, so they could take a step forward. Last year, struggling with a lot of mediocre quarterback play, but still managed to have a pretty good season, so I would say they should be in the mix for the favorites. As you can see, I have Clemson and Florida State as the top 2 teams. I do have Clemson beating Florida State. North Carolina State, I have 5-3, so just 1 game short of the favorites, but pulling an upset win over Tennessee in the non-conference. Miami, people are high on them because they have a lot of talent, but they have not utilized the talent they have the last few years. And so I do think they slightly underperform here, not quite finishing in the top tier. Still finishing top 4, though. It's not a bad season, but it's not quite what they were looking for in terms of contending for the college football playoff this year. In terms of the dark horses, besides those 4, one team I've heard mentioned a few times is Virginia Tech. Coming off a bowl season, bringing back some key young talent. Like, could they make dark horse run to the ACC title? Another team that I think is really interesting this year is Georgia Tech. Every year there's that one team that pulls just random upsets and then loses random games. A few years ago, South Carolina, they beat Clemson and they beat Tennessee down the stretch to knock both of them out of the college football playoff. Who's that team this year? And I think Georgia Tech could be that team, and they'll have some opportunities. They played Notre Dame and they play Florida State. I think Georgia Tech knocks both of them off. So I don't have Georgia Tech in my list of contenders, but I think if everything comes together, they could be a contender in the ACC. But that's my pick for this year's wildcard team that pulls random upsets and finishes with a respectable bowl record. Another team that I think improves after a down year last year, after losing quite a bit of talent from the year before, is Pittsburgh. A lot of people giving up on Pittsburgh, saying, oh, they can't get it done this year. I think they bounce back and finish in the top half of the conference, actually finishing tied for second with Miami and NC State. Louisville, I think they take a step back after some of their losses, but stay kind of in the mix there at 6-6. I've got North Carolina not falling off too far, even after losing Drake May. Amarian Hampton's back at running back for them, so he'll be really good. Could be ACC Player of the Year. I think Wake Forest bounces back and makes a bowl game. SMU, first year in the conference, squeezes out enough wins to get to a bowl. Same with California. I think Boston College bounces back at the bottom. We've got teams like Stanford, Syracuse, and then Virginia. Player of the Year, I could go with Amarian Hampton. I could go Grayson McCall. I thought about that, but I'm going to go with DJ Uiagalelei, former Clemson and Oregon State quarterback. Played pretty good last year. Coming back to the ACC, I think he has a nice season for Florida State as we see Florida State face Clemson for the conference championship and a chance at the college football playoff. Moving on to the Big Ten. Big Ten and the SEC both split with two of the biggest four most often mentioned championship contenders this year. SEC with Georgia and Texas, Big Ten with Ohio State and Oregon. So I do have Oregon finishing first in the conference standings. The game between Oregon and Ohio State is at Oregon, so I think that Oregon's home field advantage plays to their favor and gives them the upset win, if you call it an upset, over Ohio State, led by Dillon Gabriel, the former UCF and Oklahoma quarterback. So I have Oregon 1, Ohio State 2. Then in third, I have Penn State finishing 10-2, losses to Oregon and Ohio State, but winning all the other games, which keeps them firmly in the mix for a college football playoff at-large bid. Iowa, I don't think they improved that much on offense this year. I know hopes are high after getting a new offensive coordinator, and I don't really know if they can get much worse, but I don't think they get that much better. Like I would say some improvement is to be expected, but I don't know if Cade McNamara is really all that great. The offense has struggled quite a bit in recent years. Last year was a low point. I think it will improve from last year, but I don't see it improving that much because I just don't know if they have the offensive playmakers to really make that happen. They have a fairly manageable schedule. They have a game against Ohio State that's likely a loss. Every other game is winnable. They play UCLA, USC, and Washington. Those are probably the three toughest games. They get Iowa State at home in a series that they've unfortunately dominated. As an Iowa State fan, I always have hope maybe this will be the year. As you can see from my projection, I do have Iowa winning, so maybe I'll be pleasantly surprised and Iowa will lose. But so there's a very feasible path to them going, to say 10-2. But even if they go 10-2, I almost wonder how much will the eye test play a factor in the new college football playoff system. I mean, now you have a little more wiggle room. You can squeeze more teams in. So let's say it comes down to a 10-2 Iowa, whose offense is really bad again. Maybe a little bit better, but not good. Or you can have a 9-3 Oklahoma, or Texas A&M, or LSU, or somebody from the SEC, or the ACC, or the Big 12s who can actually score. I wonder if that plays a factor, or if they say, no, we'll go with the 10-2 Iowa team from the Big Ten, even though they only score 15 points a game. We will put them in. I honestly think the eye test could play a factor, and I think that could definitely hurt Iowa. So Iowa, I don't see them as a contender for the Big Ten championship because they no longer have divisions, so they can't win the Big Ten West anymore. And I don't see Iowa as finishing with a better conference record than Penn State, Oregon, and Ohio State, or even two of those three. Other potential contenders, I have Michigan dropping off a little bit from last year. They have a non-conference game against Texas that's going to be big. I think they lose that, but I think they do pretty well in conference. They're bringing back Donovan Edwards. Didn't play as well last year, but was pretty good 2 years ago as the backup to Blake Corum. And even with Jim Harbaugh gone, I think they kind of continue being a really solid team. So I don't think they're quite playoff this year, but I think they will be in the mix for Big Ten championship should Oregon or Penn State or Ohio State slip up. And then Wisconsin, I have finishing with a solid record, another not super exciting team that ends up with just, a solid amount of wins. So similar to Iowa. They play a non-conference game against Alabama, which will be interesting, but I don't see them winning that. So Wisconsin and Iowa, both fairly boring teams that will finish with, more Big Ten wins maybe than you feel like they should have won. For the new arrivals, other than Oregon, I don't have super high hopes for them winning big. I think USC's defense will still hurt them. So I think USC finishes with a solid record, but not quite as good as last year. I do think UCLA will outperform USC this year. I see them beating LSU, but LSU beating USC. UCLA goes to 8-4. Washington has Will Rogers in to replace Michael Penix, new coach, new system, new players. I think they could take a step back. This might be a little high for them, but I think they do probably finish in bowl game range, not too close to the top of the Big Ten. Some other teams, I think, Minnesota finishes with enough for a bowl. Maryland, Rutgers, Illinois, Indiana finish just short, and Nebraska. Every year it's like, oh, is this the year they're actually going to get to 6 wins? They haven't been bowl eligible since, I think, 2016. You think about how much hype they have every year. I mean, it's not like hype like Texas hype, but, every year they're borderline top 25. Oh, this could be the year they're going to win the Big Ten West, and usually they don't live up to it. And this could be a different year. They got Dylan Raiola, the high-ranked recruit. Matt Rule's in his second year, and he's been a really good college coach, even though his NFL coaching did not go so well. So maybe this is the year that Nebraska turns it around. I'm just not sold on it. They were really close last year to getting to a bowl game, finished 1 win short. So it would not surprise me if they finish, 6, 7, maybe 8 wins, but I see them more somewhere in the 4 to 8 range. I think is a pretty good guess for where they end up. I don't see them as breaking into the top half, but I don't quite see them bottoming out and finishing with less than 4. So if I had to take a pick, I would say actually probably between 4 and 6, but with a little room to be better than that. My Big Ten Player of the Year, I've got Dillon Gabriel from Oregon. Guy puts up stats wherever he goes. He was a real Heisman contender last year, so I think he should win Big Ten Player of the Year this year. Ohio State has a lot of talent, but I think some of the talent will cancel each other out. They've got 2 really good running backs, so I don't see one starring enough to warrant that consideration. I think they're going to focus on a more run and defense heavy approach this year, basically trying to copy Michigan to beat them. And so I think that does also potentially hurt, the quarterback, Will Howard's stats, and Emeka Egbuka and some of the other receivers. So that's why I'm going with Oregon's star quarterback, Dillon Gabriel, for Big Ten Player of the Year. Finally, we turn to the SEC, and SEC I think is going to be deep. I think there's going to be a lot of bowl teams this year. In fact, I only had 2 teams missing a bowl game out of the new 16-team SEC. So 14 SEC teams going to a bowl. So definitely a deep conference. Starting off with probably the most boring pick, I've got Georgia, undefeated SEC champion, and they do play all 3 of my next 3 top teams. The game I think that scares me most is not Texas, but rather Alabama, because they have struggled against Alabama in recent years. I think a big difference this year, though, is Nick Saban is no longer the coach of Alabama, and I think Kalen DeBoer is a really good coach, but it's going to be a new coach, a lot of new players. They lost a lot, replaced with a lot of new players, and it's going to be week 4 or 5, I think, so earlier in the season. So Alabama won't be quite as seasoned yet, so I think Georgia steals the win, even though it's at Alabama. I also like Georgia over Texas and Ole Miss. So breaking down the next 3, we have another tiebreaker situation because we've got 3 6-2 teams, and none of them play each other, which is kind of weird. But we've got Alabama at 6-2, Texas 6-2, and Ole Miss 6-2 in conference play, all 10-2 overall. So after record and head-to-head, it goes down to record against common opponents. Based on that, after analyzing that, Texas does take the tiebreaker here, so I have Texas going to the SEC championship game, even though I kind of think Alabama could end up being a better team this year, or potentially Ole Miss as well. Other good teams this year, I'm not quite as high on LSU as some people are. I've seen LSU as a popular CFP team. Last year they went 9-3 with the Heisman, Jaden Daniels, carrying them on his back with a really bad defense. And I just don't see Garrett Nussmeier carrying them on his back like Jaden Daniels did. And unless the defense drastically improves, I don't think it's going to be enough to get to the 9-10 wins you need to truly be in the playoff race. So I have them dropping off considerably, going 4-4 in conference play, 7-5 overall. Teams that perform better, Missouri, I think, is the next best. Was last year a flash in the pan, or can they sustain it? They did bring back their star quarterback and receiver. Their coach is back, so I think there is some level of sustaining potential here. So I have Missouri going 5-3 in conference and 9-3 overall. But will that be enough to make the playoff? It's going to be like the NCAA tournament. You got the bubble watch. But for college basketball, the bubble watch starts, with a lot of the more middle-of-the-road teams versus real strong mid-majors. For this, it's still going to be, you take the 9-3 team or the 10-2 team. I don't know. So that's going to be an interesting thing to see. Other notable ones, I have Kentucky 4-4, 8-4. That's about the most Kentucky type season I can think of over the last few years. So solid. Don't beat anybody too good. Don't lose anybody too bad. Just chug on along, beat Louisville, and get to a bowl game with 8 wins. A&M, I think they do improve a little bit in Mike Elko's first year. Maybe get Connor Weigman healthy for a full season. I have them actually beating Notre Dame, so another team beating Notre Dame, but I don't think they're quite good enough to break into the top half in Elko's first year. Oklahoma, I think, takes a step back with Jackson Arnold leading the way after the loss of Dylan Gabriel. So I do think they are not quite going to be in the top 5 for the SEC this year, although they definitely have the potential to play their way up there. And then Tennessee has also been a fairly popular team. A lot hinges on the breakout potential of Nico Iamaleava, so I think they could potentially struggle at times. So I have them going 5-3, 8-4 overall. I think they, in Josh Heupel's system, he can definitely make quarterbacks look good. And they did almost beat Alabama last year, but I think they don't quite finishing as a true contender either. Other notable things: 2 hot seat coaches, Arkansas and Florida. I think Florida does get to a bowl game under Billy Napier, but they do have a brutal schedule. I have them going 6-6. Whether that'll be enough for him to keep his job, I don't know. Arkansas, on the other hand, after losing KJ Jefferson, they could be in for some struggles. Sam Pittman's been a pretty good coach, had a really good year a few years ago, but this might be the end of the line for him. I have them only going 1-7 in conference, 4-8 overall. Mississippi State, despite being really bad in conference, I have them still sneaking into a bowl game with a 4-0 non-conference. And then Vanderbilt, lovable Vanderbilt, going 3-9 overall, 0-8 in conference. Some other notable ones: South Carolina, really good a couple years ago, especially pulling off those couple upsets, but last year was kind of a down year, and then they lost Spencer Rattler, so I think they could take another step back, but maybe sneak into a bowl game. Auburn, I think, improves a little bit, but there's kind of been this weird alternating cycle between them and Alabama in the Iron Bowl. When it's at Alabama, usually Alabama dominates. When it's at Auburn, Auburn either wins or makes it really interesting, even when they're not playing very well. Last year was one of the years where they made it really interesting before the miraculous throw from Milroe on 4th and long. So this year it's at Alabama again, so I think Auburn does get smoked in that one, but still plenty for a 7-5 season. That is my SEC predictions. Player of the Year: Carson Beck, Quinn Ewers, Jalen Milroe, Jackson Dart. A lot of good choices. But if you look at Kalen DeBoer's coaching record, he has been really good with quarterbacks. Most of his work has come with Michael Penix, but still, he's had a pretty good record. Did good at Fresno State too. So I do think that he's a good coach. I think they do take a slight step back by Nick Saban standards, but I think they're in good hands long term. I think Jalen Milroe is Player of the Year for the SEC. So looking at the conference championships, and this is where it gets interesting because this is where we're handing out 5 of our 12 spots in the playoff. So starting with the Big 12, we had Oklahoma State versus Kansas State. Even though Kansas State is the 1 seed, I think Oklahoma State wins this one as the better team. I'm not quite as high on Kansas State. Obviously, I did still have them in the Big 12 championship, but I don't think they win the Big 12 this year. So Oklahoma State gets 1 spot in the tournament. For the Big Ten, I have Ohio State avenging the loss to Oregon. So you have 2 12-1 Big Ten teams. Ohio State gets the auto bid and the bye. Oregon gets the 5 seed. For the ACC, Florida State Clemson, I have Florida State avenging their loss, getting in at 10-3. And then Georgia, I have them beating Texas for a second time to finish 13-0 in the regular season. Now, for the last auto bid, the 5th conference is going to be going to a group of 5 conference since the Pac-12 is down to 2 teams. They're basically playing as independents this year. So I think it could be really interesting because there's only 1 auto bid available. So I think it's going to come down to strength of schedule, record, and all that stuff. So I think the team with the likely to get the best record is going to be Liberty. I have them going 12-1 instead of 13-0 last year because I have them getting upset by Appalachian State. They've pulled off some big upsets over the year. This year, they get a big one over Liberty to keep them at 12-1. And with the overall weakness of schedule, I think that could definitely hurt Liberty. Best team out of the MAC, I have Toledo 10-3. Mountain West, I have Boise State at 10-3. I do think they tend to get overrated, especially over the last few years, just based on how good they used to be. I think they're going to be definitely a solid team, and they did finish strong, after a rough start. But I don't see Boise State as the representative this year, and I don't see Toledo either. So then it comes down to the Sun Belt and the AAC. Out of the Sun Belt, I have Appalachian State, same team that beat Liberty. After a down year last year by their standards, I have them breaking through, going 11-2 this year with a big win over Liberty. And that's going to be a highlight win that's going to be tough to beat, but I do have Memphis going 11-2 as well. And considering the tougher strength of schedule, they have to deal with Tulane team that even though they lost their coach, and their quarterback is still going to be tough to beat. UTSA lost their quarterback, but they're going to be a tough team. So I think Memphis gets in at 11-2 over App State and Liberty and Boise State and Toledo. Memphis gets the final auto bid after the other teams. Before we reveal the playoff bracket, looking at the Heisman, I said I really do think Jalen Milroe takes his game to another level this year. He's improved every year he's played. And like I said, Kalen DeBoer, good coach, good quarterbacks coach. So I think Jalen Milroe takes the Heisman over. I would say my runner-up would be Dylan Gabriel. Because as we saw last year, team success is super important, but the biggest thing is stats. Well, both of those go hand in hand to give you the Heisman winner. You could argue Michael Penix should have won last year, had an undefeated Washington team, really good stats, but Jaden Daniels' stats were just too hard to ignore. And so Dylan Gabriel is going to put up really tough to beat stats this year, but I think Jalen Milroe could do it. Both teams are going to be good. Carson Beck and Quinn Ewers, I just think the teams are going to be good enough where they'll run the ball quite a bit in the second half of a lot of games. Could potentially hurt their stats, and it's kind of like we've seen this story before. I don't see them elevating their game to a level that's going to be high enough to warrant Heisman consideration. Ollie Gordon is probably the best non-quarterback option, but it's hard for a non-quarterback to win, as we've seen in recent years. So I'm going with Jalen Milroe as my Heisman pick. Now looking at the playoff, we've got in the 1 seed, Georgia, obviously 13-0 overall 1. Ohio State gets the 2 after going 12-1. Coming down to Oklahoma State or Florida State, you could argue Florida State with the tougher schedule should get it. But I think since Oklahoma State would be 11-2 and Florida State 10-3, I think record's still going to play a big factor in the committee's minds. So I've got Oklahoma State getting the 3, Florida State getting the 4. Already said Oregon, I think, gets the 5, and I have Memphis as the 12 playing them. So that leaves us with 6 more at-large bids. And so I think at that point, if this all played out according to how I think it's going to play out, Alabama, Ole Miss, and Texas would all be locks as 10-win SEC teams. And in this case, I think going to the SEC championship could actually hurt Texas because if they pick up a third loss, I think that knocks them below the other two, considering it came on tiebreakers, not head-to-head. So I have Alabama as my 6, Ole Miss as the 7, and Texas as the 8. Penn State as a 10-2 Big Ten team, I have as the 9 seed. So that leaves 2 spots, and this is where I think it gets really interesting for who gets those last 2 spots. So looking at the contenders, I haven't gone over Notre Dame's schedule yet because they don't play in a conference, but I think they're going to have a pretty solid at-large argument. They have a tough schedule, but it's a favorable schedule where I think they could arguably be favored in every game. But I do have them picking up a couple of upset losses. I think they probably finish 9 or 10 wins. So I have them losing to Georgia Tech, as I mentioned, in a big upset, Texas A&M, and then also USC. So they go 9-3, similar to last year. So is that enough? So who are other contenders? So we have a 9-3 SEC team in Missouri. And then don't forget that Utah went 10-2, didn't make the Big 12 championship, but they're going to be tough to ignore at 10-2. And then the other teams in contention, you have Iowa 9-3, Kansas 9-3, NC State 9-3, Clemson would be 9-4 and probably out, same with Kansas State. So out of this mix, I do think this is where that debate gets really interesting. Do you take the 10-2 team from a quote unquote lesser conference, or do you take the 9-3 team from a tougher conference? Or do you take Notre Dame? And so I think based on name recognition, I think the safest pick here for the 10 spot is actually Notre Dame. They're going to have solid schedule as an independent, playing teams from most of the Power 5 conferences. I mean, this is a projection, so they might not lose those 3 games. Maybe they go 10-2, or maybe they go 11-1. And so I think they are a safer pick just because Missouri, yes, they play in a tougher conference, and that's going to help with strength of schedule, but it also makes it harder because you're playing tougher teams, so you're going to pick up more. You're more likely to pick up more losses. So I think that could hurt Missouri. And then for that final spot, like I said, I do think the record will still play a huge factor, and so I think Utah does steal that last at-large. It could be the Big 12 or the ACC, but I don't think the SEC and Big 10 sweep all the at-large bids like a lot of people are projecting. Just because, I think as big conferences, they're going to cannibalize on each other a little bit, drag each other down with losses. And so I think at least one at-large goes to a non-Big 10 or SEC team. And so this year I have that going to Utah since I didn't have them in the Big 12 championship. So Big 12 gets 2, ACC gets 1, American Athletic gets 1, Big 10 gets 3, the SEC gets 4. So I would say the biggest snub in this scenario would be Missouri as a 9-3 SEC team with pretty good record and resume. But I think NC State is really interesting as well because if they do have that big win over Tennessee, finish 9-3 overall, 5-3 in conference play, I think they would be definitely a tough team to ignore as well. So top 25, pre-playoff, post-regular season. Georgia's the 1, Ohio State's the 2. The first 12 are just the rankings for the CFP, so this is just kind of how I rank the teams that got left out and stuff like that. So we've got Georgia 1 at 13-0, Ohio State 2 at 12-1, Oklahoma State 3 at 11-2, Florida State 4 at 10-3, Oregon's 5 at 12-1, Alabama 6 at 10-2, Ole Miss 7 at 10-2, Texas 8 at 10-3, Penn State 9 at 10-2, Notre Dame 9-3 at 10, Utah 11, 10-2 overall, and then at the 12 seed Memphis 11-2, and then here are the bubble teams that just missed. At 13, Missouri going 9-3. At 14, NC State going 9-3. I've got Clemson at 15 going 9-4. Iowa at 16 going 9-3. Kansas State 17 going 9-4. Kansas at 18 going 9-3. And then App State 11-2 at 19. Liberty 12-1 at 20. Boise State 10-3 at 21. Tennessee 22 at 8-4. Number 23, Michigan at 8-4. Number 24, UCLA at 8-4. And then number 25, Toledo at 10-3. So then, who's actually going to win in the college football playoff? So we'll start with the 8-9 game, Texas-Penn State. This is an interesting one. I do think Texas tends to get overrated a little bit. They did finally prove themselves last year, though, and they brought back a lot of talent. Penn State hasn't really proven themselves in these big games either. They're happy to finally get to the college football playoff, but I have Texas moving on to play Georgia for a third time. Maybe third time's the charm. At the 5-12, Oregon over Memphis. Oregon throttled Liberty last year, and I think Memphis is probably a better team overall, but I think Oregon wins this one and moves on to play Florida State in that coveted 5 seed. Oregon using it to their advantage. At the 7-10, we've got Ole Miss Notre Dame. Here's our first upset. I've got Notre Dame over Ole Miss, moving on to play Ohio State in the 2. And then Alabama, Utah. Utah's been really good in the Rose Bowl 2 years ago and 3 years ago, but I think they lose this one to Alabama, moving Alabama on to play Oklahoma State. Georgia, Texas. I think Georgia wins for a third time. Florida State, Oregon. I've got Oregon winning over Florida State. Ohio State, Notre Dame. I've got Ohio State beating them. And then Oklahoma State, Alabama. I've got Alabama over Oklahoma State. So this gives us an all Big Ten SEC Final Four. Georgia, Oregon is going to be interesting. I mean, I think people have wanted to see Oregon, Georgia ever since that last one they played for Georgia's dominant championship season. Georgia dominated that one in non-conference first game of the season, but they haven't played since. This one I think is closer, but I think Georgia still wins it. Ohio State, Alabama. I've got Ohio State edging out Alabama, trying to follow the Michigan run the ball and play defense blueprint to the championship. So these are the two most popular teams, and I think there's a good reason for it. Both are probably the most talented teams in the country, and I think it's, a good guess that one of the two would win. A lot of people picking Ohio State, a lot of people picking Georgia. Last year, I actually picked the champion right. I had Michigan winning. Unfortunately, I didn't get any of the other 3 playoff picks right. So I was 1 for 4 on playoff picks, but I got the champion right. This year, it's not going to be an exciting pick, but I'm taking Georgia over Ohio State, and so I've got Georgia as my championship team. Alabama makes the Final Four post Nick Saban under Kalen DeBoer. Ole Miss, Penn State finally break through to the playoff. We see a group of 5 team make it for the second time from the same conference as the first one, and we do see an SEC team get snubbed for a Big 12 team. So those are some of the things I think could happen. These are my record projections. You may agree, you may disagree. You can leave it in the comments below if you disagree. Consider subscribing for more great content. And also, let me just remind you that while these projections are guaranteed to be accurate and completely satisfactory, I would not recommend gambling based off them, just in case, because, sports is unpredictable. Weird things can happen. So while I am totally confident in these picks, after going 1-4 for playoff picks last year, I would just caution you to not waste your money on gambling on them, because I don't want you to blame me if you happen to gamble on them and then you lose your money. That's all. And you've been listening to my College Football 24 projections presented by Drew Hill for Over the Hills Productions.